we'll go ahead and get started. Today I wanted to talk about not necessarily what consent is in human subject research. I feel that a lot of us know what that is, but I want to kind of address some of the process and how we go about implementing consent in human research. So some of the objectives for today's talk are going to be to discuss the elements of the informed consent process for human subject research. We're going to discuss the concepts of therapeutic misconception and equipoise. When I learned that word equipoise, for some reason it's just a word I like. And then understand the importance of health literacy during the informed consent process. So what is the purpose of the informed consent process? Someone, Manuel et al., they said that it was to ensure that individuals control whether or not they will enroll in the clinical research and participate, and when the research is consistent with their values, interests, and preferences. To explain the elements that are necessary to ensure that individuals make rational and free determination of whether the research trial is a consonant with their interests. So when we're explaining consent, there are some things that we need to keep in mind. Whether or not we have informed that individual correctly of what is going to happen during the research study and whether or not that is something that they wish to participate in. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the regulations. That's not really what we're trying to do, but just to kind of go back over some of the documents that have helped form our consent regulations today. There's the Nuremberg Code from 1947. This was a result of all of the atrocities in Nazi Germany against individuals who were confined in the types of research that they conducted. And from that meeting, that's where it came down that consent needed to be in place and that it needed to be voluntary. It was very, very important that those who participated in research had a say in whether they participated or not, and that the benefits must outweigh the risks. There were several concepts that came out of those, but these are some of the highlights. The Declaration of Helsinki in 1964 further added to that by also adding the need for independent review committees, thus the IRBs, and that the research needed to be conducted by qualified individuals. There needed to be some protocols in place that indicated whether or not a person was qualified to do that type of research. And then the most recent one, the Belmont Report, which I think everybody is really aware of, where they talked about the respect of persons, benefits, and justice. And these are some of the documents, the more historical documents, that help formulate where we are with our consent processes today. So before we get started on this, I wanted to show a quick video, maybe, we'll see if I can, to kind of talk about consenting. Okay, I know that some of you couldn't quite hear that, and I'll actually send it to you in a private way, but let me get my the PowerPoint back up. Well, I think what we're going to do is, I don't seem to be able to get them back at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and give my talk, and you'll just have to look at my face. So in the meantime, what we were talking about was the elements of consent. And what we need to do is, in the video you saw where, well, she had the consent parts to her video. She did not have, it was the manner in which she gave the presentation that was off to some extent. She approached the person, and the person really wasn't ready to listen to her. She was involved in something else. Hold on a second. We've got it back up. So you can see here the elements of consent, that she didn't talk about the statement, what the purpose of the study was. She also went through where the study would be conducted, what the risks were, and she hit on those elements of the consent. However, what she wasn't doing was listening to the individual as to what her concerns were. She really never gave her an opportunity to ask questions. She forced her through. It was more or less, here's a study, sign, and let's do this. So when we're doing consents, we need to keep in mind the needs of the participant that we are addressing. So when talking to them about the purpose of the study, are they really involved in the conversation that you're having? Now, I understand a lot of times these are pre-planned clinic visits. If they know that you're going to be there, they're prepared. But a lot of times we have to coldly approach participants. And in that case, we need to give them the option of talking to them at another time if need be. But just to review the elements of consent for what we're going to talk about here as we move forward, the statement that the study involves research and that participation is voluntary. Obviously, this goes back to our historical documents of why that is so important, and that making sure they understand that this is not something that they have to participate in order to still keep receiving care. The purpose of the study. What is it that we're hoping to get from the study? Is this a drug trial? Is this going to be a lot of questionnaires? What is the gain that we're hoping to get from this particular research? We need to let them know where the study is going to be conducted, how many participants we hope to have in this trial. This is important as far as letting them know how big the trial is. If you tell them that you're only going to be having 5 to 10 subjects in the trial as opposed to 5 to 1,000, that gives them a different idea of the importance of some of the research and where it is in the study chain. Making sure that they understand clearly what is going to happen, the procedures, and how often they need to I used to say return to the study center, but now that may change. But how many times are they going to be asked to take time to be in the research study? I think sometimes those are glossed over, and families don't realize just how many times they need to provide information again, or they come to a visit and they don't have the information that you're going to be requesting, such as what other medications have you taken? And so often they say, oh, well, we took some cough syrup. Well, if you're monitoring the con medications, you'll want to know, well, what type, what was the dosage, how often did you take it, and that information. If you give this information prior to the study even starting, they know what is going to be expected of them. And making sure that they understand what the expectations are is critical to making sure that they are able to make an informed consent. Going over the risks and the possible benefits of being in the study. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. And then also including information about pregnancy if that's appropriate. But it's very important to make sure that they understand whatever those risks or possible benefits are. Again, this goes back to the historical documents and the regulations. Other treatment options that might be available. Are there other ways to treat this? Currently in research, we have a lot of first-in-human type trials. Or as in the cancer trials, there really isn't any other options. But what would happen if those did come forward? During the Tuskegee trials, that was one of the biggest issues, was that there was a treatment available to these participants and that information was kept from them. Are there going to be any costs involved? There's a whole different discussion about those studies that require the patient to pay to be in the study. Most typically, the studies include some type of incentive or reimbursement to the families for expenses that they might incur in order to participate in the study. What happens if there are injuries caused during the study? This is another one that is often discussed. In other words, if they were injured, who is going to pay for that information or those types of services? If there are new findings, if during the course of a study, other studies come up and they show where there is a new treatment available, do you make that information available to them? Also, incidental findings, whether or not during the course of the study there are procedures that indicate that there is another issue ongoing. Do you disclose that to the subjects or do you just not even worry about it? Withdrawal criteria. It's very important when you're even going into a study that you know what those criteria are. If a patient decides to withdraw from a study, they no longer wish to participate, what exactly do they mean by that? Do they wish to just withdraw any information from that point forward? Or are they also indicating that information which is behind that has already been collected? If samples have already been collected, what do they wish done with those samples? Do they wish them to be destroyed? And if that's the case, how do you go about making sure that those samples are destroyed per their instructions? How to participants' personal and confidential information will be protected and who will have access to it. That one there is a very big issue currently with all of the data that we are collecting and storing and using to feed the artificial intelligence and also hacking. How are we going to protect their information? Will it be identified, de-identified? Who's going to have access to that? With the multi-site studies ongoing, a lot of times we're sharing that information, not just within our institution, but with other institutions, as well as federal and government institutions. Make sure that they understand who will be getting that information. And lastly, who to contact if they have questions or a problem. Make sure that they know how to contact somebody if all of a sudden there is some type of adverse event that they're undergoing and they don't know how to handle that. So when explaining the purpose of the study, a couple things to keep in mind. One, obviously, consents are supposed to be written at an 8th grade level using common medical terms. But what exactly do we mean by that? And lately, there's been a lot of talk about the disparities that exist in the healthcare world. And a lot of this has started with the low health literacy. Some of the information that I was reading indicated that as many as almost 25% of our population are unable to navigate the medical field. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services describe health literacy as the degree to which individuals have the capacity to obtain, process, and understand basic health information needed to make appropriate health decisions. One of the biggest examples of this was during my pediatric years, and listening to a parent who their child had been placed on anti-seizure medications, and they were calling in because their child was just seizing like crazy. And in talking to the parent, the nurse discovered that they had stopped giving the seizure medication to the patient. And when asked, well, why did you do that? Well, they stopped seizing. This was an individual who had very low health literacy and not realizing that the seizure medication was to continue regardless of what, if the standing. And the parent was looking at it like antibiotics. You give it to them until whatever the problem is stops, and then you stop giving it to them. So these are things that sometimes we take for granted because we work in the health field, that things that to us it's a seizure med, you have to keep taking it. Some of our families don't, and we have a tendency to talk over their heads sometimes, rather than using some of those communication cues of, do they have that deer in the headlight look, that are they understanding what it is we're actually trying to explain to them? And that is where it's very important at some points to ask the patient to give back information to you. In other words, ask them a question as to whether or not they understood that. If you're taking the medications and all of a sudden you start throwing up, what will you do? That their feedback will then help to confirm that they understood what you were telling them or they weren't. And then also be sure to differentiate between what clinical research is and what clinical care is. Two different concepts altogether. And sometimes even our physicians and principal investigators have a hard time understanding where those two differentiate. And in some cases, they are actually the same, in the sense that the only way we can take care of them clinically is to use a research protocol. That is the only thing available at that time. We'll discuss a little bit more, but in 1987, an investigator by the name of Applebaum termed the phrase therapeutic misconception. This was where he explained that a lot of times there are patients who don't realize that the research or their clinical care is actually just research, and that it's very difficult. We saw that a lot of times in the pediatric trials where a parent would come in and not realize that what we're doing is research. And when we would give them the guidance of, in one instance, there were two brothers who had the same disease at different time points. One had already become wheelchair bound where the other one wasn't. For the protocol, the one that was not wheelchair bound qualified for the study. The one that was wheelchair bound did not. When it came about that the medication was really doing what we wanted and what we were looking for, the parent could not understand why we were unable to give that experimental medication to the child in the wheelchair for this life-threatening disease. They had therapeutic misconception. They did not realize that this was not a clinical care, that this was a research, and we were looking for answers. And that also leads to the next point, which is equipoise. Equipoise is conducting a study with no preconceived idea of, if you had two different medications, which one would be better. And obviously, if a researcher is conducting a trial, they have some idea of what they believe will be the outcome. That is addressed in their specific aims or their hypothesis that this is the outcome that we are expecting. And of course, sometimes that's not what they get, but being able to maintain that unbiased outlook on what is going on in the study is difficult sometimes to maintain. That's why sometimes they actually go to blinding to make sure that that is pulled out. And then of course you need to make sure that there are no language barriers. We live in a very multicultural culture anymore, and there are a lot of different languages in our society. So making sure that the individual understands clearly. Sometimes, trying to take one of these 40 or 50 page consent forms and have it translated is costly. So sometimes then you use the interpreters. But prior to that, it's important that you use a short form that is going to explain to the participant that you're going to be discussing research and what research is before the interpreter even gets started. So when talking about risk versus benefits, you want to make sure that you include the likelihood that risks can occur. But you want to be careful about the terminology that you use. Since getting into research, I have always become so specific as to the meaning of words because they can really convey a lot. So for instance, if you were describing risks or benefits, you want to avoid using qualitative descriptors such as, well, it's a very rare side effect, or it's just a little side effect. You don't want to use those. If you can quantify what those incidences are, well, it only happens in about 10% of the population out of a study that had 100 that only occurred 1 or 2 times. Don't assume that you know the study participants' attitude towards risks. What may seem like a big risk to you, they may not see as a risk. Something that you see as small, oh, we're just going to, do a blood draw. To them, it may be major if they have a huge avoidance of needles. So don't assume that you understand or know where they're coming from. In high-risk studies, make sure that you provide sufficient time for those participants, well, any studies, to truly review the risks and the benefits prior to sitting down with them. A good process is a lot of times to provide them with a copy of the consent prior to meeting with them so that they have time to read through it and think about what questions that they might have. Sometimes the studies can be rather complex, and for someone who has maybe a lower health literacy rate, it may be a little bit harder for them to understand what is being asked and then to pose the questions that they have. And don't assume knowledge that you do not have. A lot of new coordinators will say, well, what do I do if I don't know the answer? If you don't know the answer, just say, I don't know the answer. Just remember that in research, we're looking for the answers to a lot of questions. So it's better to say that you don't know and then say, I'll get back, let me check with the investigator, maybe they know, or let me look into that and I will get back with you. And then always make sure that you get back with them. And also be sure that you also look at any findings that may have been discovered during the preclinical trials. And the Jesse Gelsinger case in 1999 that resulted in the participant's death, one of the findings after the investigation as to what had occurred, one of the findings was that there was information that was in the preclinical trials about they had done some animal studies with monkeys where of the three, two of them had passed due to this trial. That information was not included in the consenting of the participant. And it was felt that perhaps if the participant had known about some of these findings from the preclinical, that they may have had a different outlook on whether or not they wanted to consent. So it's important that that information also be included, that you look to see what those preclinical studies might have also shown. Even if they were in animals, some of that will be equivalent to what is going on. I always feel like I need to ask for questions at this point, but I'm not face to face. Documenting the process. So this is one of the things that when you first get started in clinical research, you always say, well, what do the regulations tell me to do? And if you go looking for a regulation that's going to spell it all out for you, you won't find it. The FDA has a way of saying, here's what we kind of want, but then it's up to the coordinator to figure out how they want to do it. So it's very important that you document what actually occurred at the time of consent. A lot of centers will use a progress note. That's what we used at Children's, that would go through and document who was present at the time of consent. For pediatric studies, that's very important because sometimes you have parents who are have different guardianships, so you want to know whether the mother was there or the father was there or both were there. Who performed the consent process? Was it the PI that explained it, or was it someone that he had delegated that authority to? Make sure whoever is doing the consent is listed on the delegation of authority log, and that they also have the qualifications to do so. We encountered a couple of studies where the protocol specified that it had to be either the principal investigator or a advanced practice nurse. And if somebody else consented, then that was a protocol deviation or violation. Where did this meeting occur? Did you consent them in the clinic, or did you consent them, as the video showed, in a waiting room? Were they able to ask questions readily? And more importantly, not only where, but when. Documenting the time and date of the consent is very important, because that is how you're going to determine if there were any protocol deviations of procedures or other items of the research study that were done prior to consent. What was discussed? Did they ask some questions? Did they seem like they understood what was going to happen? One of the things that we had utilized at Children's was a comprehension quiz for some of our harder studies, where they would be asked a couple of questions. Again, this is them feeding back to us, acknowledging that they understood what the study was going to ask of them. And this was a way of documenting that they did understand. Did a participant receive a copy of the consent? Protocols or regulations do state that they should receive a copy of the consent. Sometimes, however, the parent says, or the patient participant says, I don't want a copy. If that's the case, then you need to document that they did not want a copy of the consent, or they did not want a copy of their signed HIPAA agreement. You want to be able to document that in case there are questions down the road. This also comes in if you give them any type of reimbursement, that it was given, so that, again, it can be documented that it occurred. Were there any special circumstances, or do you need a note to file about something that was a little off during the consent visit? And then also whether or not there were all the inclusion criteria met, or were they pending. A lot of times when they're at their consent visit, you will get initial labs. Obviously, you don't have those results just yet. So you need to document that, yes, they complied with all of the items that were requested at the consent visit or the initial visit, but as far as being in the study, that was not determined yet because those were pending. And also make sure that you go back when you get those results and document that you did receive them, so that you have a full circle of your documentation. So what happens if you don't? There are lots of reasons that you would have an error, but some of the more important consent errors would be if you obtained the consent after they'd already had an MRI or had lab testing. This is very important if we ran into it. If you ask a patient to get labs before they're actually consented, that would constitute a protocol violation, or and then also asking them to fast. If you're asking them to do something that is for the research study only before they've actually signed the consent, you need to be careful about some of that. Some of those at Children's, we would actually have a screening consent form in order to carry that out. A big one is if the consentee did not finish signing or dating the consent. A lot of times you want to ask the parent or the participant to also print their name, because some of the signatures, you don't know who signed it because it's unreadable. Using an incorrect consent or version of the consent, it's very important that you track that so that when you're initially consenting or at any point that you're using the correct version date. And sometimes this can be a little hard to track if you have a protocol that keeps changing. Using some type of tracking measure is sometimes really important on that. When the participant did not actually meet the inclusion criteria or had an exclusion criteria you were unaware of. Sometimes that information is not discovered until afterwards. And if you've already started some of the procedures, then it wasn't a proper consent. And those a lot of times need to be reported. A lot of these things will depend on the individual IRBs as to what they want reported and what they don't. One of the big things that we ran into in pediatric trials, which you'll find, is that making sure that if the participant is not able to sign for themselves, being over the age of 18, then you have to make sure that the legal representative that is with them has the ability to sign for them. In pediatric trials, again, sometimes you have parents who are divorced. Who has the legal custody? You have step parents. And you have to ask if they have legal consent. A lot of cases there were ones where the parent might say, yeah, I can sign. They're a step parent, but they can sign, but they don't have the legal ability to sign that. And then also, and even at Ohio State, we have those like wards of the state. Make sure that you have the proper information about who can sign for them and who can't. So these are all things that you want to take into consideration when approaching that consent process. It's not just a matter of going down and reading the consent to the participant and then saying, so do you want to be in my study? You want to have an interaction with the participant or the parents to make sure that there is a give and take as far as the information that is being discussed, that when you just disclose it to them, that they have an understanding. Um, these are sometimes referred to as some of the soft skills of doing consent, where you were actually paying attention to the participant and you're reading their verbal cues or their nonverbal cues. And those are some things to really keep in mind as we move forward in this new COVID world, as I refer to it, of the telehealth, the telemedicine. Don't disclude those verbal and nonverbal cues that you get. As you saw in the video, where the woman was not making eye contact anymore, and was looking off like, help me, I don't know what's going on, I don't understand. If you're seeing things like that, you need to stop. Also make sure that if there are, we had at Children's where there, all the siblings are there too. Sometimes ask another coordinator to take the children off into another room so that you can discuss it with the parent. Or in the case of a very busy clinic waiting room, if you're trying to discuss a study with a participant in that type of environment, you may not have their full attention. So you want to make sure that you have that type of attention going. So let me see if I can get the chat. We have time for a few questions. And any time as far as going forward, if you have questions along the lines while you're in the workforce, go ahead, send them to me. I don't mind. So the last one is just some upcoming trainings. And I wanted to take a few minutes to update everyone on some of the changes that we're currently making. First, ORRP has 2 upcoming trainings that had to be delayed due to COVID. They're also going to be conducted over Zoom. The first one is the Human Subjects Research 101, which will occur on May 20th. They're also going to be doing event reporting on June 23rd, and there will be more announcements about the pre-registration for that event as we get closer to June. Fingers crossed, in June we might be able to do face-to-face, but I'm not holding my breath. As far as the clinical research professional training series, we are going to start not requiring you to go in to register into Zoom and also register in Buckeye Learn. We're just going to have you register in Zoom. I am in the process and hope to roll it out for June of having a newsletter called CR Connect, where we will post all of this information, that it will be hopefully a one-stop shop as you go forward of if you want to see what trainings are available, there will be a calendar there of what things are available. And then also other events that are ongoing. Right now, ACRP is asking for those that are in the workforce, that have been in the workforce for a while. Their November journal is going to be talking about those that have been in the workforce for a while and seen what kind of changes they've had. So make sure that if you enjoy writing, that you look into that. So to start moving this forward, trying to form a network, excuse me, of coordinators at the Ohio State Institution, so that we can begin collaborating more with one another, also learn from one another. There's a lot changing in the research world right now, especially the clinical trials, and it's important that we are there for one another. So these are things that we can look forward to. All of this information will be sent to you later today, the slides along with a certificate of participation that you can use to for your CEUs. And I'll also be sending out emails to this particular group. If you know someone who would like to join it, just have them send me an email so that I can add them to my listserv, so that we can start growing it and sharing that information. As also a go forward, if at any time you have a topic that you would like to learn more about, please feel free to reach out to me and we can get that information in a presentation. And or if you have a department that you're having a particular issue, in other words, you're having a lot of consent errors and you feel like you as a department need to have a review of those processes, I am more than willing to do those type of trainings. Some of the other things that we're hoping to add throughout the end of the year is to have a more formal onboarding process, and then also to offer a leadership series to those that are in the higher roles within the clinical research profession, to help start building our managers for tomorrow. So those are some other initiatives that we're kind of working on. A lot of things have been delayed due to COVID, but stay strong, stay healthy, wear your masks. And with that, I don't have any other information. So again, slides will be coming later today along with your certificates of attendance. And that's really all I have. So thank you for joining us today. And with that, I'll give you 8 minutes back to your day that you didn't think you'd have. Thanks for coming. Bye.